Hidden impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, how, how psychological and social changes increase pediatric type 2 diabetes, presented by me. By the end of this presentation, you should be able to understand how the rates of pediatric type 2 diabetes increase during quarantine, how psychological/social changes can affect health behaviors in youth, and also be able to connect the research findings to real life experiences. So, what is pediatric type 2 diabetes? So, just to give a quick refresher, pediatric type 2 diabetes is a chronic condition affecting children where the body becomes resistant or unable to produce enough insulin, which regulates blood sugar. Insulin not working properly usually leads to a buildup of glucose in the bloodstream, which further leads to possible like kidney issues or nerve damage or possible other complications. Unlike type 1 diabetes, which is caused more so by the immune system attacking insulin cells, type 2 diabetes is most linked to lifestyle and environmental factors. What changed during the COVID 19 pandemic? As you all know, the COVID 19 pandemic resulted in a quarantine where the lives of youth, adults, and the elderly were greatly affected. For youth, especially children who were, just starting out their schooling, quarantine led to major impacts in their education, especially since they couldn't traditionally be in the classroom due to lockdown. Lockdown also further affected children socially and mentally. Some of these effects can still be seen among children today. So, for example, think about your own routine during lockdown. Did it affect you? And if so, if you know, do you believe those effects have stayed with you over time? Psychological changes in children with type 2 diabetes. So, these disruptions during the pandemic also led to a big impact on mental health. Many children during this time were experiencing an increase in anxiety, depression, stress, and loneliness. Research shows that adolescents with type 2 diabetes already often experience something that's called diabetes related distress, which is the emotional burden of living with and managing diabetes. Based on this research, we can see that mental health was already a major factor for pediatric type 2 diabetes before the pandemic. The pandemic likely worsened these challenges. Behavioral changes in children with type 2 diabetes. So the changes in mental health weren't only emotional, but they also affected behaviors. During the pandemic, children had become less physically active and spent more time on their screens. They also experienced changes to their sleeping and eating habits. Research itself also suggesting that there were increases in sedentary behavior, which is little to no physical movement, sleep disturbances, and overall poor diet during this time. These changes can lead to an increased risk of pediatric type 2 diabetes and also further complicate the health of children already living with it. And with this basically brings us to the question of, how do these emotional and behavioral changes actually affect the body? How does this affect the body? As I spoke about in the third slide when describing what pediatric type 2 diabetes is, with children being less physically active and having changes to their eating habits, their bodies become inefficient at using insulin, having insulin resistance. The emotional strain can also affect the body by increasing certain hormones like cortisol, which leads to further negative impacts on the regulation of glucose. I also meant to mention over time, these changes increase the risk of developing type 2 diabetes as well, especially in children who are already vulnerable. Research findings. Based on the research in pediatric type 2 diabetes, one study found that diagnosis in type 1 and type 2 diabetes increased during the pandemic. The study notes that type 2 diabetes especially had a significant increase compared to previous years. Another research study also found that when it comes to pediatric type 2 diabetes, mental health comorbidities are prevalent. Many of those children with type 2 diabetes experience other mental health disorders such as depression alongside diabetes. Another thing that I feel like is important to note is that there are there are even like also environmental factors that come into play with the increase in the diagnosis of pediatric type 2 diabetes. Research notes that structural racism that is in place, which is limiting things like access to healthy foods and adequate health care. There's structural racism in place that is limiting things like access to healthy foods and adequate health care. Race and ethnicity are also something that are commonly being used to determine whether someone receives adequate medical care. The big connection. When putting these studies together, there's a clear pattern is emerging. One study is able to show an increase in type 2 diabetes during the pandemic, while the other shows that there's an increase in mental health challenges that are usually associated with type 2 diabetes in children. These suggest that psychological and social changes may have played a major role in increasing the risk of pediatric type 2 diabetes. Real life versus research. During the pandemic, kids were not just being less active, they were unfortunately stuck inside on their screen most of the day and disconnected from their daily routines. If you combine this with possible limited access to healthy food options and also possible ongoing mental health struggles, it definitely helps to explain why we've seen increases in the diagnosis of pediatric type 2 diabetes. So, in conclusion, the pandemic didn't just affect adolescents emotionally or socially. It led to real physical health consequences. The increase in pediatric type 2 diabetes diagnosis overall highlights how mental health, behavior, and the environment are all interconnected. We can see from this that children's health is influenced by a lot more than just their biology. It's important to look at other possible factors like mental health and the environment around children when it comes to assessing and preventing pediatric type 2 diabetes. And then here are the research articles that I used in this presentation.